You may wonder why I'm giving my Bible study from this room in our basement. Well, this is where I have all my books. And some of them are traditions. I have old memories and journals. We have photographs down here. And some of these books have beliefs that make no sense. Some of them are really good. It's important to examine what we believe and why we believe it, and not to believe everything, right? And so it's traditions that we need to evaluate, and that's where we're going with our Bible study today. It's in Mark 7, 1 to 23. Now, one of the traditions we have is that the Pharisees are seen as the villains in the Gospels. Are they the villains? Why would they hound Jesus and eventually decide that he needed to be killed? That sounds like a villain to me, doesn't it? Was it because they were bad people? No. Everybody knew they were good people. So why were they doing this? You know, some of the Pharisees were even followers of Jesus, but it was important for them to know what Jesus was teaching. That's why they followed him around. And to answer the question, we need to back up a few centuries. The Jewish writers tell the story of how the Hebrew people abandoned worship of God and his commandments, and they went their own way, and that ended up in them being taken captive by Assyria and Babylon, and then the Persians, and then the Greeks, and then the Romans. So the religious leaders didn't want to feel abandoned by God like that ever again. And so they tried very hard to keep the people from being defiled. And so to do that, over the centuries, they have created this kind of fence around the people. And this fence was to give them behaviors that they knew wouldn't defile them, that would keep them in the good graces of God so they wouldn't be punished again. To accomplish this fence, the Pharisees and scribes then over these centuries had come up with over 600 laws of behavior that they expected everyone to obey. And a lot of these laws had been for the priests, but the Pharisees thought everybody should do it in order to stay holy, right? Unfortunately, some of these traditional rules, they had unfortunate results. They ended up nullifying the very commandments that God had given to Moses. But it's so odd because they didn't seem to realize it. So, in our story today, news about Jesus being followed by thousands of people had made it all the way up to the rulers of the powers in Jerusalem. The religious leaders at the temple needed to identify and prevent anyone who would lead the people astray. So they needed to send a delegation down to see what Jesus was up to. What was he teaching? What was he doing? And so when they got there, they watched Jesus and his disciples closely to see. And whenever they saw him diverting from one of their traditions, they challenged him. It only makes sense. What they saw was that he was dangerous to the people, to their religious traditions, and to their political authority. Well, they were afraid the Romans would come down on him as well. In fact, Jesus was teaching what God really wanted. Now, we know all that, okay? So that background helps us understand our story for today. It's a dialogue between Jesus and these religious leaders, and then we hear him explain what really defiles people. So, Here's the story in Mark 7, 1-23. Now, when the Pharisees gathered to him with some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem, they saw that some of his disciples ate with hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed. And then Mark puts in this parentheses because he's not writing to people who know these rules and laws. He says, "For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands properly, according to the tradition of the elders, and when they come from the marketplace, and they don't eat until they wash. And there are many other traditions they observe, such as the washing of cups and pots and copper vessels and dining couches." And the Pharisees and scribes asked him, "Why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands?" And he said to them, "Well did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men.' You leave the commandment of God and hold to the tradition of men." And he said to them, "You have a fine way of rejecting the commandments of God in order to establish your tradition. For Moses said, 'Honor your father and mother,' and whoever reviles father and mother must surely die. But you say, if a man tells his father or mother, 'Whatever you would have gained from me is Corban,' that is, given to God, then you no longer permit him to do anything for his father or mother, thus making void the word of God by your tradition that you have handed down. And many such things you do." All right, let's stop there to understand what this Corban thing is. It's pretty awful, actually. And I suppose that's why Jesus chose this extreme example to show what he's talking about in an emphatic kind of way. Because at that time, old people like me didn't have any safety net. The family was supposed to support them, especially the son, right? This traditional law then allowed the son to declare that his wealth belonged to the temple. And so he couldn't give it away to anyone, not even his parents, to support them. He could use it for himself, but when he died, the proceeds went to the temple. The rule then allowed grievous selfishness and a pretty good income for the temple. But in the process, it completely set aside the law of Moses they were trying so hard to keep. The commandment said that the son should take care of the parents. But this law was a loophole to get around the law. The traditional religion then wasn't protecting the people from defilement. Instead, it was defiling them. So now Jesus explains how those rules defiled the people. So picking up in verse 14, "And he called the people to him again and said to them, 'Hear me, all of you,'" and this is including the delegation from Jerusalem, "'understand. There is nothing outside a person that by going into him can defile him, but the things that come out of a person are what defile him.'" All right, that's all he told the crowd. He left them to figure out what it had to do with the rule he'd been discussing with the religious rulers. But then Mark lets us in on a private conversation where Jesus explains what he had just said. "And when he had entered the house and left the people, his disciples asked him about the parable. And he said to them, 'Then are you also without understanding? Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile him, since it enters not his heart, but his stomach, and is expelled?'" And of course, Jesus is now referring to their tradition about not eating pork and so on, right? And since Mark is writing to a congregation that may have been both Jews and Gentiles, he said, "Thus Jesus declared all food's clean, so stop arguing about it." What's that got to do with the Corbin rule he was just discussing? Well, Jesus explains, starting in verse 20. What comes out of a person is what defiles him. Now, here's what it all means and why that example was used. He says, for from within, out of the heart of man, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, foolishness. All these things come from within, and they defile a person. So Jesus is teaching that their traditional religion actually promoted evil. Now, Jesus has put his finger on a fundamental problem with a religion based on traditions. Although they have the appearance of righteousness, they can result in actions and attitudes that are anything but righteous. Well, they could even result in war. I mean, it's terrible because if you think you're fighting for God, you can do anything atrocious that comes to mind because it's for God. So, in my first drafts of this Bible study, I was starting, I had pages of lists of things that Christians do, our traditions, various things. There's so many of them, I had to cut them all out. This would have gone on for an hour. It's, well, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to remind us of Jesus' priorities, of God's priorities. And then I'm going to remind us that Jesus said, you have many such traditions like this. Then you can go ahead and evaluate your own beliefs and traditions to see if they actually are righteous. So, here you go. What are God's priorities? When Jesus was asked, what is the greatest commandments? He listed two of them. And they're from the Hebrew Bible. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. And the second was like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. Nearly all the religions have that last one, right? It's called the Golden Rule. It makes sense, though, this love emphasis, because John's first letter said God is love. Anything someone does that's not from love is not from God, even if it is your tradition. So Jesus gave only one commandment. He told his disciples in John 13:34-35, a new commandment I give you, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another. By this people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. How many times does he have to repeat that? Okay, next. It's important to know that nearly all the letters in the New Testament were written to churches who had undergone persecution, were done being persecuted, or were just going to go into persecution. But not only that, these letters were written to churches who were undergoing internal strife from arguments about traditions and beliefs. So evil was coming on them, and evil was coming from them. That's why the letters were written. Christians were fighting over their traditions and beliefs. And early on, most of these divisions were between the Greeks and the Jewish people in the church over whether Gentiles had to become Jews in order to be Christians. Sounds kind of crazy nowadays, doesn't it? But that's what they were doing. Both thought they were being righteous, but neither were being righteous. They thought they were defending their faith, but they were only defending their ideas. They were neither righteous nor defending their faith. They had forgotten God's priorities of love. Paul had to correct the church in Corinth because they were dividing over teachers. In 1 Corinthians 3:3-4, he writes, "You are still fleshly. For where there is jealousy and strife among you, are you not fleshly? And do you not live like unregenerate people? For whenever anyone says, 'I am with Paul,' and another, 'Well, I'm with Apollos,' are you not merely human?" They were acting from human rivalries. Not that these teachers were wrong, but the people were using these teachers to divide themselves. Instead, we can see in Ephesians 4:1-6 what God demands of his people. Instead of hating on each other, they were to, quote, "walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you've been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace." So not only were they not supposed to be fighting with each other, they were supposed to be eager to maintain their unity. Well, unity in spite of being annoyed with each other. That's what love is like, isn't it? The reason for it is that, quote, "there is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to the one hope that belongs to your call. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all, including you." That is, God is not divided by human traditions, and so neither should his people divide over their own human traditions. So in our text today, Jesus tells the disciples the attitudes and behaviors that will divide them. So now we're starting in verse 21. He says, "For from within, out of the heart of man, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, and foolishness. All these evil things come from within and they defile a person." And I don't think this is a comprehensive list. He's just giving examples. And we tend to focus in on that sexual immorality part because I think we really still have prurient interests. And we love to throw away people who we think are immoral. And we barely notice the rest of the list. However, if a person thinks he is being righteous but insists on their own traditions and teachings, and then he slanders others who don't follow his traditions or his beliefs, they're not being righteous. That person who is slandering isn't being righteous. He's defiled by pride, evil thoughts, wickedness, deceit, and slander. Now, I'm using the pronoun he because that's what Paul used. He's talking, well, you know, it was a patriarchal society, right? So he, she, both, right? And other, I guess. Where does this fealty to our human traditions come from? Just us? Why do we fight among ourselves over them? This is what Paul warned the Ephesians who are doing that very thing. He says in Ephesians 6:12, "We should not fight with fellow humans over these things because we do not wrestle against flesh and blood." Yeah, other people, right? "But against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places." So now, there we can see who the villains in the Bible really are. It's not the Pharisees and the scribes in our lives. It's not the people with whom we disagree. Villains are spiritual beings who are influencing us. God calls us to love one another. We were created to love and to work together. That's what God's will for us is. But these spiritual forces hate us and work diligently to break us apart, to break our unity of love. We must not allow this. Stay aware of this devil's schemes to split you and to cause you to reject one another over your traditions. These schemes of the devil, they lead to our defilement. So, now, evaluate your traditions. What are the result of your beliefs and traditions? I heard some good advice from a preacher. He said, be careful who you choose to teach you and to teach you what you should believe about your brother or sister or other churches or maybe even other faiths. Instead, think and understand what the will of God is. Remember what Jesus commanded, because what he commanded is the will of God for us. Here it is again. God commanded us to love one another. Do good to your enemy, he said. God commanded us to be eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. And the saddest thing in the world, and we see this over and over, and it's happening now in Ukraine and Russia. Paul warned the Galatians in 5:14 to 15, the whole law is summed up in one statement, namely, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. But if you bite and devour one another, watch out that you're not consumed by one another. That's war. Could be denominational war, church splits, consume one another. Let's not do that. Instead, let's build each other up in love. Let's maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. That's God's will for us. Isn't it? Amen.